The cold wind swept through the dimly lit street as James sat on the sidewalk, pulling his thin, tattered jacket tighter around his body. His breath came out in small clouds, disappearing into the freezing night air. The cardboard sign in front of him, scrawled with shaky handwriting, read, "Veteran in need of help." His eyes, weary and sunken, scanned the empty road, hoping for a kind soul to stop, though he knew better than to expect much. A low rumble broke the silence, and James looked up. A police car rolled to a stop a few feet away, its headlights slicing through the darkness. The flashing red and blue lights cast eerie reflections on the wet pavement. James stiffened, instinctively lowering his gaze as the car doors opened. Officer Daniels stepped out first, his tall frame and rigid posture exuding authority. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto James as he adjusted the strap of his belt. Behind him, a younger officer hesitated, his movements uncertain, his expression betraying unease. Daniels took a step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel, the sound echoing ominously in the still night. James didn't move, his hands clenched tightly in his lap as the officers approached. "Get up," Daniels ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. James hesitated, glancing up briefly before lowering his head again. He didn't want trouble, but it seemed trouble had found him anyway. Officer Daniels strode forward, his boots hitting the pavement with an authoritative thud. His voice boomed as he addressed James, his tone sharp and unrelenting. "Hey, get up! You can't sit here and beg like some bum. This is private property." James, startled by the aggression, looked up slowly. His calm demeanor was in stark contrast to the officer's hostility. He spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion and dignity. "Sir, I'm not hurting anyone, just trying to survive." Daniels sneered, his lips curling into a mocking grin. He crossed his arms, staring down at James like he was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Yeah, well, survival doesn't mean bringing down the neighborhood. Move along before I make you." For a moment, James didn't move. He met Daniels' glare with a steady gaze, his silence carrying a quiet defiance. But the threat in the officer's voice was clear, and James didn't want to escalate the situation. With a heavy sigh, he lowered his head and began gathering his few belongings. His hands trembled as he carefully placed a framed photo of his late wife into his worn backpack. Next, he reached for a faded military badge, holding it for a moment as memories of a life long gone flashed through his mind. Daniels watched him with a smirk, tapping his flashlight against his palm. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably nearby, his eyes darting between James and Daniels. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression, but he remained silent. "What's taking so long?" Daniels snapped, stepping closer. Without waiting for a response, he yanked the backpack out of James's hands. "Let's see what you've got in here." "You don't have the right to—" James started, his voice firm but calm. "Oh, I've got every right," Daniels interrupted, unzipping the bag. He began pulling out James's belongings, tossing them carelessly onto the ground. A pair of worn gloves landed in a puddle. A small notebook slid across the sidewalk. The framed photo clattered face down, the glass cracking slightly. James reached out instinctively, his heart sinking, but Daniels was already holding up the military badge with a mocking laugh. "Military, huh?" Daniels scoffed, turning the badge over in his hands. "Bet you were dishonorably discharged, or maybe you just wore this for fun, huh? Pretending to be something you're not?" James clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he stared at the badge in Daniels' hand. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, but the weight of years of struggle held him back. He knew that arguing with someone like Daniels would only make things worse. Daniels leaned closer, his voice dropping to a taunting whisper. "You're just another failure, aren't you? A burden on society. No wonder you ended up here." James closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breathing. The anger and humiliation burned inside him, but he refused to let it show. Slowly, he bent down and began picking up his scattered belongings, his movements deliberate and careful. The younger officer finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "Daniels, maybe we should just let him go. He's not causing any harm." "Stay out of it," Daniels barked, not even glancing at his partner. "This is exactly the kind of trash we need to clean off these streets." The younger officer fell silent, looking away as James continued to gather his things. The cracked photo of his wife, the wet gloves, the notebook with pages smeared from the puddle, it all felt like pieces of his dignity being torn apart. But he didn't say a word. "Hurry it up," Daniels ordered, tossing the badge onto the sidewalk. "And don't let me catch you around here again." James picked up the badge and slid it back into his bag, his hands still shaking. He slung the backpack over his shoulder and stood, his eyes meeting Daniels one last time. There was no fear, no anger, just a quiet, unyielding strength that made Daniels hesitate for a split second. Without another word, James turned and began walking down the street, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. Behind him, Daniels stood with his arms crossed, watching him go, while the younger officer stared at the ground, his face shadowed by regret. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Whispers of disapproval rippled through the group as people watched Officer Daniels rummage through James's belongings. A few onlookers took out their phones, the faint glow of recording screens cutting through the dim streetlight. "Leave him alone, officer. He's not hurting anyone," a bystander called out, their voice steady and filled with indignation. Daniels turned sharply to face the crowd, his expression hardening. "Mind your business," he barked. "This man is trespassing. If you've got a problem with that, take it up with the law." The murmurs grew louder, a mix of disapproval and outrage. James stood slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling back on Daniels. His voice, though soft, carried a quiet strength. "I served this country, sir. I don't deserve this." Daniels let out a cold laugh, shaking his head as he stepped closer, towering over James. "Yeah? Then where's your proof, huh?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "All I see is a failure." James swallowed hard, the weight of humiliation pressing down on him, but he stood his ground. The crowd's voices grew louder, emboldened by his quiet resistance. "You've got no right to treat him like this," another bystander shouted. "He's a veteran." "Show some respect." Daniels turned his glare toward the crowd, his frustration evident. "If you don't disperse right now, I'll start arresting people for obstruction," he barked, his hand hovering near his baton. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the crowd and Daniels. The tension in the air was palpable, the situation teetering on the edge of chaos. The recording phone stayed fixed on the scene, capturing every word, every gesture. James, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, spoke again. "I've given everything to this country. I fought for the freedom you're enjoying right now, and you choose to humiliate me." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth and pain. Daniels hesitated for a split second, the faintest flicker of doubt crossing his face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Pack up and get out of here," he snapped, his tone harsher now, as if trying to regain control of the situation. But James didn't move. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, as the crowd's murmurs swelled into open outrage. Officer Daniels reached for his handcuffs, his expression cold and unyielding as he moved to restrain James. The crowd gasped, their murmurs turning into shouts of protest. Just as Daniels was about to snap the cuffs around James's wrists, the sound of another police car pulling up broke the tense atmosphere. The vehicle came to a halt, and the door swung open. Out stepped Captain Morgan, a senior officer with an air of authority. His sharp eyes immediately scanned the scene, landing on James. For a moment, he froze, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock and then to deep respect. "Sergeant James Mitchell, is that you?" Captain Morgan's voice was filled with disbelief. Yet there was a warmth to it that silenced the crowd. James looked up, confusion flickering across his face. He studied Captain Morgan for a moment before replying cautiously, "Yes, sir. Do I know you?" Captain Morgan took a step closer, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "You saved my life in Afghanistan. Don't you remember? That ambush. You carried me out under fire when no one else could. You're a hero, James." The crowd fell silent, the weight of Morgan's words hanging heavy in the air. Gasps rippled through the onlookers as they began to realize the significance of what had just been revealed. James, the man they had seen treated so cruelly, was no ordinary homeless veteran. He was a decorated war hero. Daniels, still holding the handcuffs, stared at Captain Morgan, his face flushing with embarrassment. His rigid posture faltered as the power dynamic shifted before his eyes. "Wait, you're saying this guy's—" Daniels started, his voice uncertain. "A hero," Captain Morgan interrupted firmly, turning to glare at Daniels. "And the way you've treated him is disgraceful. Is this how you honor those who've sacrificed for this country?" Daniels stammered, his confidence crumbling as the crowd murmured louder, their phones capturing every moment of his humiliation. Captain Morgan turned back to James, his tone softening. "I'm so sorry for what you've been through. We need to make this right." James stood silently, his composure steady despite the whirlwind of emotions in the air. The respect in Captain Morgan's eyes was unmistakable, a stark contrast to the contempt he had endured just moments before. The scene shifts momentarily, fading into a flashback. Grainy footage plays, evoking the chaos of a battlefield. Gunfire echoes as soldiers scramble for cover. Amid the chaos, a younger James, in full military gear, drags a wounded soldier, Captain Morgan, through a hail of bullets. James's face is streaked with sweat and dirt, his jaw set with determination. Explosions light up the night as he pulls Morgan to safety, shielding him with his own body. The scene fades back to the present, the memory lingering like a ghost. Captain Morgan's expression hardened as he turned to Officer Daniels, his voice cutting through the tense air like a blade. "Stand down, Daniels." Daniels froze, his hand still clutching the cuffs. The authority in Morgan's tone left no room for argument. "But sir," Daniels stammered, his voice faltering. "You humiliated a man who's given more to this country than you ever will," Captain Morgan snapped, his voice rising with anger. The crowd erupted in murmurs, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "I didn't know, sir," Daniels tried to explain, his face red with embarrassment. "Exactly," Morgan interrupted sharply, stepping closer. "You didn't bother to find out. You saw a homeless man and made assumptions. You let your prejudice blind you to the truth. This man," he gestured toward James, "is a hero. A decorated veteran who saved my life and the lives of countless others. And you treated him like trash." Daniels looked down, unable to meet Morgan's furious gaze. The crowd, emboldened by Morgan's words, began to cheer and applaud. The younger officer, who had remained silent throughout, shifted uncomfortably, clearly shaken by the unfolding scene. Morgan turned back to James, his expression softening as he reached out a hand to help him to his feet. James hesitated for a moment before accepting, rising slowly. Morgan bent down, picking up James's scattered belongings with care, brushing off dirt from the cracked photo and placing it gently into James's hands. "I'm sorry, James," Morgan said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "For everything. You deserve better than this." James looked at Morgan, his eyes glistening with emotion. He nodded, his voice steady but thick with gratitude. "Thank you, Captain." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their voices filling the cold night air. Phones captured the moment as Morgan stood beside James, a stark image of respect and redemption against the backdrop of an earlier injustice. Daniels, meanwhile, retreated to the side, his face a mixture of shame and defeat. Captain Morgan placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder, his expression filled with resolve. "James, you've done enough for this country. Let us take care of you now," he said firmly, his voice carrying both authority and compassion. James's eyes welled up with tears, and for a moment he was speechless. He finally managed to respond, his voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, sir. I never expected this." Captain Morgan gave a small nod, then turned to the younger officer standing nearby. "Get in touch with the veterans' shelter downtown. Tell them we've got someone coming tonight, and I want them to give him the best care possible," Morgan instructed. The younger officer nodded quickly, moving to make the call. Meanwhile, Captain Morgan turned to the crowd, addressing them with sincerity. "Thank you all for standing up for what's right. It's because of voices like yours that justice prevails." The crowd cheered again, their phones still capturing every moment. James, standing tall now, looked around at the faces of the people who had defended him, a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years beginning to blossom within him. Morgan's gaze shifted to Daniels, who stood off to the side, avoiding eye contact. With a sharp tone, Morgan addressed him. "Daniels, your actions tonight were unacceptable. You've not only disrespected this man, but disgraced the badge you wear. Effective immediately, you're being placed on mandatory sensitivity training. I'll be reviewing your conduct personally." Daniels opened his mouth to protest, but quickly closed it, realizing there was no room for argument. He nodded stiffly, his face flushed with shame. Morgan turned back to James, his expression softening once more. "You deserve better, James. You're not alone in this anymore." James nodded, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Captain, for everything." The scene faded as James walked toward the waiting police car that would take him to the shelter, his belongings safely in hand. The crowd watched in respectful silence, their earlier cheers replaced by a quiet reverence. Captain Morgan stood tall, watching James go with a sense of pride and determination to ensure he'd never be forgotten again. What started as a night of humiliation turned into one of justice and redemption, proving that true heroes don't wear capes. They walk among us, even when the world turns its back on them.